panelists are LSU Professor of History, Kodi Roberts, author of Voodoo and Power, The Politics of Religion in New Orleans, 1881 to 1940, Noel Voltz, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Utah, and a scholar of African American and African diasporic history with a particular interest in women of color and slavery and freedom in the United States, and NYU Professor Hisai Diner, who focuses on Jewish studies and who was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in the field of intellectual and cultural history in 2010. Please welcome the panelists.
Okay, so I think we're going to each speak very briefly, then have a conversation, perhaps thinking about some of the issues that both unite our papers or our talks, what makes them different, and obviously to engage with you if that's possible. So I have to begin my brief remarks by saying that I feel a little bit like a imposter here in that I am not a scholar of New Orleans at all, although New Orleans has popped up in a lot of my work as a place where the people I study, which are Jewish immigrants to the United States, and indeed the period before the creation of the United States, where they lived, where they created a set of communal institutions, where they did business, and where they interacted with the people around them. So New Orleans, it's not that it wasn't present, but it has never been the actual focus. So I want to make three remarks and then pass the microphone, as it were, on. And so first, I've been placed here on this panel, and I'm really honored to have been invited on a panel on religion. And while I think scholars debate what does religion mean, why is it different from some other aspect of culture? If we think about religion as worship, as engagement with a sacred text, in the case of my subjects, Judaism, that is certainly one way to think about them and about those Jews who made their home in New Orleans, but it also could be approached as a matter of ethnicity, about a collectivity of women and men, or a group of women and men who founded a set of institutions, communal practices that were social, cultural, political, welfare-oriented. It would be not synagogues, although synagogues are really important in the history of the Jews of New Orleans, as well as elsewhere, but it could be lodges of the B'nai B'rith Association, or the Workmen's Circle, or the Hebrew Benevolent Society, Zionist societies, grocery stores, kosher markets. These were also part of the infrastructure of Jewish life, and they fall more or less outside of the domain of what we might think of as Judaism. So in that context, I want to ask, I've been asked a couple times since I'm here, or I've been told, well, the Jewish community of New Orleans was different. Okay, it was different than other Jewish communities, and which my historian's antennae go out, because how do we define what's different? And in some ways, it resembles nearly all the mid-sized Jewish communities which planted themselves in the United States. These were communities in which the Jews did not engage in industrial labor, and that makes it very different than New York or Chicago, the big cities where the garment industry, which was the Jews' economic niche, was the main employer of immigrant Jews. But the Jews of New Orleans, like the Jews of Charleston or San Francisco, were engaged in business. Okay, and it was business at the very lowest level, that is peddlers who would go out into the countryside every week with packs on their backs, or going in a horse-driven cart, selling stuff. Okay, domestic goods to customers, and then coming back to New Orleans on the weekend. okay, to replenish their packs, to pay their creditors, to then spend the Sabbath. Although we do have one memoir of a Romanian Jewish peddler based in New Orleans who talked about coming back on the weekend. He never talks about going to the synagogue. He talks about playing poker and drinking whiskey with the other Jewish peddlers who are all gathering there over the weekend. So hence, why religion? And that Jewish business nation, New Orleans, just like the one in Charleston or in San Francisco, and again, fill in so many other places, Seattle, was one that existed at that bottom rung, and then shopkeeping to poor customers, increasingly shopkeeping to better off customers, department stores, and up to some of the princes of both wholesale and retail. So in that way, New Orleans was really very much like all other mid-sized Jewish communities in the United States. If I want to say it was different or somewhat different, it got very little in the way of very little in the way of an East European Jewish migration. It did not get that massive wave that between the 1870s and the 1920s sent about 3 million Jews to the United States from the region east of from the Austro-Hungarian Empire east. They didn't come to New Orleans in particularly large numbers, and that's a bit unusual, although, and New Orleans was also, again, somewhat unusual in that it had a fairly substantial migration of Alsatian Jews. Okay, and the Alsatians are interesting because they come with French, and therefore, particularly as peddlers, they're able to go out in the countryside and sell to the French-speaking people in the more remote areas. It also got a somewhat larger Romanian Jewish migration, and that was partly because the Romanians were migrating from the southern European ports, which then were linked to the port of New Orleans. Okay, whereas the vast majority of Jewish immigrants who came to the United States came from the ports in Germany and Belgium and the Netherlands, which were directed to New York. Okay, and so they wouldn't have made that journey to New Orleans as a kind of organic following of the shipping lines. Okay, and New Orleans was also somewhat unique in that it was a bastion of the Reform movement. And partly because it didn't get a large East European Jewish migration, it therefore had relatively little in the way of orthodoxy. And because it had relatively little in the way of orthodoxy, it also then did not develop much in the way of a conservative movement, which was the religious expression of the second generation of the East European Orthodox immigrants. I do want to say before I talk a little bit, and hopefully I'm not encroaching on anyone else's time, that while we think of New Orleans as in the annals of American Jewish history as a city of high levels of integration, of Jews who did very well in business and who were able to socialize with their non-Jewish peers in the elite, New Orleans actually produced probably the only significant Hebrew language poet to come out of the United States, a man by the name of Ephraim Lasitsky. And one would know of Ephraim Lasitsky if one was a scholar of Hebrew poetry and Hebrew literature. And he came from Ukraine and ended up in New Orleans, and again is acknowledged as maybe the only important Hebrew poet to come out of the United States. That was not an American Jewish specialty. And similarly, one of the most important leaders of the Zionist movement, James Heller, was the son of Rabbi Max Heller, New Orleans rabbi. And Jimmy Heller, was an extremely important figure in Zionism in America and on a global scale, and again, a New Orleans native. Okay, so I want to say 2 minutes about the origins of this community, and my title in the brochure said from the Code Noir to Respectability. And the Code Noir, which, I mean, the black code, why would Jews be involved in that? And this edict, which regulated commercial and religious standards within the French Empire, and was particularly concerned with the supervision of the details of African slaves, African slave trade, included 3 clauses for the specific exclusion of Jews and Protestants from all of France's American colonies, including Louisiana. It was revised several times in the 17th and 18th century, particularly importantly in 1724. So the code said no Jews. Okay, and presumably if no Jews, then no Judaism. Okay, but on the other hand, there were Jews present in the days of the code, from deeds, land grants, newspapers, legal records, and indeed from records of Jewish communities or Jewish, particularly business people in places like Suriname, Curacao, Jamaica, Barbados, Newport, New York, Charleston. We see references to Jews from New Orleans trading both with their co-religionists or co-ethnics, whichever word we want to use, in the Atlantic world. So the banning of Jews and Protestants presumably related to the matter of conversion of the slaves, and according to the Code Noir, slaves had to be baptized as Roman Catholics, and therefore the concern was that non-Catholic slave owners would convert their slaves, forcibly or not, presumably forcibly, to either Protestantism or Judaism. So that may have been one of the reasons Jews are included in the Code Noir, and there are obviously Jewish slaveholders all over the Caribbean, in places like Curacao and Suriname, where most of the Jews who show up in early New Orleans had first come from. It's also possible that the Code Noir included this ban on Jews, as well as Protestants, because it would have been an economic challenge to the monopoly of the French Catholic business interests that wanted to make the lion's share of the profits. So I want to say something very briefly about Jacob Monsanto, who was Isaac Monsanto, who was a Sephardic Jew, born in the Netherlands, lived in Curacao, and came to New Orleans to establish himself as a merchant in the business of shipping slaves and other cargo from the Caribbean to the Gulf of Mexico. He's probably the first Jew that we know of who lived in New Orleans. He was not the only one. There were a number of others. Their names are in some ways not very important, but the fact that they lived here, despite the Code Noir, the fact that their names show up in deeds, in various kinds of business documents, indicate that they were deeply integrated into the business community of New Orleans. Monsanto on several occasions actually went to court. Okay, fighting, he once goes to court to fight for restitution from British privateers who had seized a ship carrying cargo that belonged to him. So the Jews who lived in New Orleans under the one might say the cloud of the Code Noir, seem to have been unbothered by the code. They did not make any efforts to press for the right to be there as Jews. They made no efforts to push colonial administrators to grant them some level of religious, I'm not sure I want to use the word freedom, but some religious rights. And just very quickly, it's a somewhat of an interesting difference than the experience of the Jews in New Amsterdam. So in the 10 years that the Jews in New Amsterdam lived under Dutch law, they had originally been told they could not pray in public. And Stuyvesant told them they could not pray in public. So the Jews come to Stuyvesant and ask for the right to pray in private in their homes and to have a cemetery. Okay, and Stuyvesant gives in. We have no evidence that Monsanto or any of the other Jews living in New Orleans did anything to, shall we say, rock the boat and to ask for rights. They live in New Orleans, seem to have prospered. He buys a very large plantation. He owns quite a few slaves. He brings several of his brothers to New Orleans. But with the arrival of the Spanish, things begin to change. And the Spanish are much more concerned with enforcing the code. And in addition, for Jews like Monsanto and his peers, the specter of Spain, the place that had expelled their ancestors. Okay, it's not that long since the Jews had been expelled from Spain, and we heard Jessica Harris's wonderful talk yesterday, and she mentions 1492 as the year the Moors were expelled from Spain. It was probably the most pivotal year in Jewish history, because the single largest Jewish community, the community of Iberia, was expelled. And so Monsanto's ancestors had been part of that expulsion. So the idea of living under Spain with the potential of an inquisition, with the potential of bodily harm, sends him and almost all the Jews out of New Orleans, and they return only very gradually, somewhat surreptitiously, and the community itself does not begin to grow in number until the incorporation of Louisiana into the United States, where they are guaranteed the right to do whatever they want, because as white people, there are no restrictions on them, and in a society which is based on the idea of religious freedom, they can create whatever kinds of institutions they want. And so it's at that point that the real history of the community begins, both as a religious and an ethnic entity. So it's very fast.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. I am so excited and honored to be here speaking for you all today. It is my sincere pleasure to be able to come and speak for all of you members of the cities of New Orleans, as well as so many preeminent scholars in the field. This is like a historian's moment of like fangirldom that's been happening as I've been seeing all of these amazing scholars that I have read over the years and have truly tried to emulate in my own work. And of course, as I talk today about free women of color in Louisiana, I could not be doing this work and would not be doing this work without the groundwork that's been laid by so many scholars before me, many of whom are here. And the shout out I really want to give, just for 2 seconds, is actually to Emily Clark and to Virginia Gould, if she's here, because it's particularly their works that I read when I was an undergrad that got me started on this journey that has now led to my first book project. And so I think that it's really important that as we think about people of the past, historically we also think about those who come before us academically and have laid the groundwork for the work that we do. And so thank you to them. This part of what I'm going to share today is one part of a larger project that I'm working on right now as my first book, which focuses on free women of color and their interracial sexual relationships with white men that occur in Antebellum, Louisiana. And so I look at that through a variety of institutions and lenses, but today I was asked to speak on religion. And I was thinking, oh my goodness, okay, I'm asked to speak on religion in front of people who know a lot more about this than I do, in terms of like the Sisters of the Holy Family. So instead I decided to sort of approach the idea of religion through telling a story of the work that I do, which is looking at how free women of color engage with the Catholic Church, sometimes because of their own personal spiritual belief systems, but also because it becomes an institution and an avenue to access freedom. And so that's what I'm going to kind of explore with you guys today. So to do this, I thought I would start with a story. And since we heard a little bit yesterday about the enslaved populations in New Orleans and references to those who have made their way to freedom, this is going to be our moment to sort of think about the positioning of free people of color color in antebellum America, and particularly antebellum Louisiana, and to think about both the tenuous nature of that freedom, but then also how these individuals, these women, tried to carve out a space for themselves and to make, in many ways, New Orleans home. Right? Even if this was not their choice of home necessarily, they are trying to make what they can of this space. So let me tell a story for you all, and it is a slightly brutal story. So it's similarly, I think, to Sophie White's story from yesterday. So on May 14, 1858, a New Orleans officer, H. Bremmel, detained 36-year-old woman, free woman of color, Constance Perrine. According to an entry written in the police journal jail record book, Perrine was a washer, cook, and native of the city, and was arrested at 11 p.m. on St. Anne Street for being drunk and disturbing the peace. And I feel like this is an underlying theme for many of the conversations today, but she's arrested. Upon her arrest, Perrine was loaded into the police paddy wagon and sent to the police jail, where she would remain for the following day. Approximately 2 hours before Perrine's arrest, another woman of color named Anise was apprehended on the corner of Dauphine and Esplanade Streets. Anise was the slave of a Mr. Rousseau and was arrested as a runaway and was sent to the police jail to await her return to her owner. Upon hearing of Anise's arrest the next morning, Mr. Rousseau went to the jail to request her release. According to Rousseau, Anise had the habit of saying she is free, but she is not yet free. And as punishment for this latest offense, and it's very apparent she does this all the time, Rousseau ordered the New Orleans jailer, Edward Blanchard, to return her to him. But first he requested that Anise be struck with 10 lashes with the pallet, and to be then brought out. Fulfilling Rousseau's request, the jailer sent for Anise, and he had her whipped. However, according to court records, that morning there was a mistake at the jail. Instead of Anise receiving the requested lashes, the jailer confused the two women and accidentally beat Constance Perrine. The beating was brutal. Not only, it was definitely not outside the norm of violence administered against slave bodies throughout the South. Despite her repeated remonstrances that she was free, Perrine was stripped naked, forcibly fastened and stretched upon a platform, and she notes, where only slaves are whipped, and did moreover then and there receive 10 lashes with a heavy whip. Perrine, who was pregnant at the time, sustained considerable injuries. The posterior of her naked body was covered with lacerations and contusions and left her incapacitated for almost a month. Her injuries were so severe, in fact, that it caused her to miscarry her 3-month-old infant baby that was inside her fetus. The legal case of the beating of Anise and Constance Perrine ends up ending up before the Supreme Court in 1860. And today I'm going to use this story both as a lens in which we can explore sort of the tenuous nature of freedom for free women of color, right? She is a free woman of color who is so close to being mistaken as a slave that she could be beaten as a slave. And yet we also see in many ways her kind of laying forth her hold of this free status, right? She's saying, I was beat where only slaves are beat. The like horror of that alone, not that I was beaten, but also the added kind of factor of being beaten in a space that is meant for slaves. But then also the fact that free women of color really engaged in the legal system, and this is one way in which they show their agency in the antebellum period, is that they present themselves in court and fight for what they see as their rights. And in fact, Constance Perrine will go and not only sue the jailer who beat her, but actually sues the city of New Orleans for basically pain and suffering for the damages that were caused to her body and to her unborn child. And so in many ways, right, this is a story of free women of color's tenuous freedom. So how does religion fit into this? Well, what we know is that free women of color, like Perrine, looked to the church as a way to find evidence that they could use to support their claims to freedom. It is very common throughout the antebellum era that free women of color will use church records, baptismal records, marriage records that mark these women as free, and they will present them before the courts as a way to say, no, this is my identity. Do not mistake me as an enslaved person. And so what we see is that they are strategically using the church as kind of a tool of negotiation. And I don't want to make any statements, and when I say the church, I mean the Catholic Church, and I don't want to make any statements about the actual beliefs of these women, right? It's probably very complex and very individual. We know from the work of Gould and Clark that many free women of color were practicing and active Catholics, and they were part of sort of a lay leadership of women in New Orleans. But we also know that many people in New Orleans, which I'm assuming Kodi will also be speaking to shortly, held multiple belief systems simultaneously, right? Whether they're practicing voodoo while simultaneously practicing Catholicism. And also the knowledge that just because somebody practices something doesn't mean that they necessarily believe it, right? But we know that regardless of individual belief systems, right? As I went on a ghost tour of New Orleans, they were like, everybody here is Catholic. Sure. That's literally was the line. I was like, yeah, I get that. Whether or not you actually believe it is a different topic and something that I can't ascertain. But what I do know is that free women of color made public declarations of their faith and used religious rituals as a way to gain and maintain freedom. In the case of Perrine, following this beating, she is horribly kind of incapacitated. She is left for over a month, and she sues for $2,000 of damages, saying she was unable to work, she lost her child. This was a horrible moment. She had to pay a doctor to take care of her, in addition to her own sister. And she sues New Orleans for $2,000. Now, as is the case, unfortunately, for the tenuous nature of freedom for free women of color, of course, the city immediately gets themselves removed from that case. They're like, yeah, no, the jailer can take all the fault for that. Right? They immediately pointed to the jailer, who doesn't have much status. But even then, the lower court will rule that she only earns $500 for her pain and suffering. And then she will pursue it again at the Supreme Court level, saying, no, I want more money for what has been done wrong to me. And again, the Supreme Court is going to come back and in this time actually only award her $150. Right, $150, $100 of which she has to pay to the doctor, the white doctor who cared for her, right? This is the reality of life for free women of color, but in her evidence that she presents before the court, one of the pieces of evidence that she uses is her baptismal records. She presents her baptismal records before the court and says, see, I am marked as free. And not only that, but she brings witnesses in who knew her godparents, who could then further attest to her freedom. And the case of Perrine is not unusual. We see free women of color using this church and creating documents, whether it's baptismal records, baptizing their children as free, or even marrying white partners before the church, even though it's illegal. They would marry white partners before the church as a way to create a paper trail that then they could use in their push for freedom, in their quest to carve out a space for themselves. And of course, I'm sure we're going to continue having a little bit of a conversation, but I would be remiss if I didn't talk about not only the ways in which the church serves as sort of providing evidence, a surety of freedom for free people of color, but also the way that it provides community and community support, right? We know that free people of color, particularly free women of color in New Orleans, created the Sisters of the Holy Family, right? That will end up serving the poor and helping educate free children of color, particularly young women of color. We know that the St. Augustine's Church will be built, and that has provided a community and a center and a network space for free people of color since the 1840s when it was created. In all of these ways, the church has sort of helped to support and sustain a population, frankly, when a city has not always wanted that population here, and has allowed them to sort of constantly recreate and remake the city to force them to acknowledge that this was the population and home for free people of color as well. So I'll turn it over. Thank you.
Good morning, guys. I work on voodoo in New Orleans, mostly in the 20th century, peaking in and around the Great Depression. I'd like to think that what's unique about my work is that unlike some of the material I've seen on what we define as African diaspora religions, I've been unwilling to engage in a discussion about racism on terms set by racists and segregationists. And I think a lot of the work on voodoo and other African diaspora traditions starts from this place, this narrative constructed during going all the way back to the 19th century, but it becomes particularly important after emancipation, right? As long as you have slavery to mark practitioners as inferior, you don't need other structures. But after emancipation, moving into the late 19th century, you get this phenomenon that then flourishes in the 20th, where cultural purveyors and legal authorities go out of their way to define voodoo as black, and then equate that blackness with Africanness, and then use that to label practitioners as backward and uncivilized. The normal discussion that I see about this kind of phenomenon is that it revolves around this notion that what we need to do is redefine African diaspora traditions as modern and contemporary and sophisticated. For me, that's problematic, because judging somebody else's religion is always a fraught, problematic exercise. For me, the demonization and the criminalization of voodoo are tied directly to the racialization of voodoo. And if in Jim Crow New Orleans, where you don't have to say that black is bad, that black is backward, that black is barbaric, then by racializing voodoo, it does all the other work for you. A lot of what my work does is bring into question this base assumption, right? That voodoo in New Orleans is a quote unquote black or African phenomenon. Unfortunately, because of the criminalization of voodoo, because going all the way back to slavery, because of the Code Noir, it's illegal to practice voodoo in New Orleans because it's not Catholicism. After the French period and then leading into the American period and post-emancipation, they find other ways to criminalize voodoo. A lot of the arrests of voodoo practitioners come because the groups are mixed, not only in terms of status, i.e. people are arrested because these are gatherings of free people and slaves, and those people aren't supposed to be in the same place together prior to emancipation. After emancipation, voodoo practitioners are arrested for all kinds of drummed up charges, things like disturbing the peace, which is a very nebulous catch-all that still works for anything when the police want to arrest someone, to all kinds of charges around swindling and economic abuses. That being said, because of this criminalization, we don't get a lot of accurate depictions of what it's like to practice voodoo in New Orleans from practitioners, because who's going to tell you they're a practitioner when you're going to lock them away for it? So what we get is outsiders telling us what voodoo is like. And then the most reliable early records about who's actually at voodoo ceremonies come from law enforcement when they record who's there when they go to arrest people. Now what's inconvenient for folks who want to look at voodoo as an exclusively black phenomenon is that every time one of these arrests occur, there are white people there, and not as spectators. So now you have this phenomenon where voodoo practitioners, voodoo is looked at as a black phenomenon, but you have to explain away why white folks are always there. The mental block and the gymnastics you have to do to make this work are impressive. I record a story in my book about the sexton, the caregiver of St. Roch Cemetery, who's interviewed by members from the Louisiana Writers Project, which is a subsidiary of the Federal Writers Project, which is in turn a subsidiary of the WPA. Where the WPA employs all of these artists and writers during the Depression, and in different spaces they find different kind of cultural phenomenon. Immediately, seemingly, in New Orleans they gravitate towards voodoo and begin interviewing people about voodoo. Undoubtedly because they've heard stories about practitioners using grave dirt and spirits of the dead in their rites. Louisiana Writers Project interviewers go straight to the cemetery and they ask the caregiver, what has he seen about voodoo? Ironically, what he says is that, and I want to quote the entertaining language. He says that, quote, anytime you see a nigger wench and a white woman come into the cemetery together, you can expect some monkey shines. His entire cue that there's something associated with voodoo happening is that there's an interracial gathering of women coming into the cemetery together. But then when he tries to explain this phenomenon, what he says is, oh, well, obviously these old black women are spoiling these white women. And he actually whines to the interviewer at the end of the interview. He says, quote, damn it, I could have gone for some of them dames myself. So the implication for him is that even though he sees these interracial gatherings coming together, that voodoo is a black phenomenon that's being imposed on these white women. This is unfortunately not just something that happens with him. People don't ask the question about whether or not voodoo is exclusively a black phenomenon, or like most cultural productions in a multiracial society, once it's on the ground here in New Orleans, it's become as multiracial and as complicated as the city. Now, that's not to say that there's no issue with race or racism in voodoo. It's fraught with all of the racial politics of Jim Crow, with the equating of whiteness with power and economic affluence, with the notion that black people and white people are so separate that even their spiritual lives require different formula and different rituals. You can't do the same voodoo ceremony on a white person as you can do on a black person, in other words. So it's not to say that race isn't an issue in voodoo, but it's an issue in voodoo in the same way that race is an issue in New Orleans, in the Jim Crow South, in America. It's complicated. That being said, a lot of what my work does is to suggest that if we stop demonizing voodoo and equating it with all these things that we think of as backward because we've assumed that this is a black phenomenon, if we look at everybody who's putting something into voodoo culturally and religiously and ritually, then we get a better understanding of what we are doing, what we are creating in these religions, and then what these religions are then in turn putting back into us as purveyors of culture. So we only have a few minutes left. I think what we'd like to do is maybe take questions from the audience.
Absolutely, I think that'd be
so
great.
that you guys can stop listening to us talk at you.
Hi, thank you. I have questions for the last two of you. First, how could a black woman marry a white man in the church since it was illegal?
That is a great question. So, although it was technically illegal according to Article 95 of the Louisiana Civil Code, what we know is that there were priests who were practicing sacramental marriages here in Louisiana as well as in the Gulf South in general. Actually, Bay St. Louis, Mississippi is another example of it, has a priest that's doing it there. In fact, I have a case of a man named E.C. Hart who ends up marrying a free woman of color, and he says literally in court, they say they got married in 1868, and they say the purpose of getting married was so that we could protect our children and that they could inherit our property, right? And they actually say this to the priest who in the court testimony says it to the court, right? So there actually are priests who are doing religious sacramental marriages. And then as well, there are also many cases of free women of color who, when getting married, don't necessarily acknowledge that they are free women of color. So I have found actually several cases of free women of color who are passing for white. They are written into the white marital registries at the archdiocese collections there. But then if you actually find them later, they are in fact people of color, right? And that kind of comes out through various court cases. So there's also a lot of moving across and between the color line that also allows people to access this church. Good question.
Question number two. This may go before the time that you wanted to talk about, but one thing that I've always thought, using Marie Laveau as the example, is that the practice of voodoo was not seen by the Catholic Church as in conflict with it. Otherwise, she could not have been married in the church, her children baptized, and buried in St. Louis number 1.
So when Marie dies, a lot of my work actually starts with Marie Laveau's death, because I want to look at how Marie functions in the community of voodoo practitioners as kind of an exemplar of what their practice should look like. That being said, after she dies, in obituaries featuring her daughter goes out of her way to paint Marie Laveau not as a practitioner of voodoo. She eschews any notion that voodoo has anything to do with Marie Laveau's life and paints her instead as a very devout Catholic. That being said, the participation in the Catholic Church, voodoo practitioners viewing themselves as Catholics, right? This is not a mask that they're wearing. These people view themselves as Catholic who have these other spiritual practices in addition to their Catholicism. And so this idea that you're Catholic and you're practicing voodoo is not a contradiction. And Marie may very well have viewed herself as a Catholic in her own mind. At the same time, she's practicing voodoo. I don't know if that speaks to your question.
That's what I always thought. And actually, I am a tour guide. When I talk to people, I explain that the word voodoo and the practice is shown up in amulets in Africa, and those are written in Arabic, which seems to make the same connection that one could be considered Muslim, practicer of Islam, and still practice voodoo.
Right. I've not a specialist on Africa, but I've seen a number of accounts of people converting to Islam. I think part of what Noel is speaking to, right? There's an association with the quote-unquote great religions gives you status in society. And so there are accounts going back hundreds of years of people converting to Islam while they still practice whatever religion is indigenous to their community in West Africa.
If I could, in fact, just add a little bit there, which is historically around the world, as Catholicism spread, it allowed for the maintenance and a kind of syncretism of pre-Christian religions in the incorporation of saints and holy spaces and phrases, which we would consider to be practices, and that is often considered one of the dividing lines between Protestantism and Catholicism as imperial religions. That Catholicism allowed this in a way that most Protestantism was much more. It's a full package, and once you get into this, you buy into the package, everything else is out.
Lady in the back.
Absolutely. This is exactly what my researcher, thank you. So she was asking about how plissage is viewed by the church and how it plays out in the church. And I think that in part it's really, and so plissage, if everybody's familiar, this is a very modern term that's been used to describe a word that means to place, right? Which was a system in the 19th century, but I think there are many scholars that stretch this back into the Circum-Caribbean writ large, but of a sexual placement of free women of color with white men. Although it isn't just limited to that, it can also be anybody who's sort of unmarried. In the law, they refer to this as concubinage, right? It's a sexual, usually an intimate relationship, a partnership that is of unequals, or people who cannot get married for one reason or another. But in terms of the church, it really seems like it's individual. I think the church as a whole thinks that it's sort of morally problematic, as do some people, members of New Orleans society. My favorite quote, Mr. Redwin puts forth a bill to the Louisiana Congress and says, like, we need to make concubinage illegal, and it was literally laughed out of the building. They're like, yeah, we're tabling this indefinitely. No, right? Because I think that while everybody's like, this is morally inappropriate. Everybody's also like, but my mother, cousin, brother, sister, aunt, somebody in my family is probably practicing this. And frankly, if these are legitimate sexual relationships that are not prostitution, you can't get married. So what is a religion, like a true relationship? What else are they going to be but kind of labeled concubines or in these sort of plissage relationships, if you will. And so because of that, I think that the church is somewhat sympathetic, right? And so that's why we see some priests, I think, in my opinion, issuing religious marriages, right? It's this idea that even if the law isn't honoring this, let's try something, right? Let's try to make this as holy as possible, even if legally it is problematic. So I think that would be, it's individual, and I think that overall it's morally problematic, but they're trying to make it work.
Gentleman here.
Yeah, for Professor Diner, I was curious about when you said there was a sizable exodus of the Jewish community during the time period. I was curious where they went until Americans took over, how they came back, that story a little more. And also, Professor Roberts, I was really interested. I'm new to the area. I noticed when I first got here, a big billboard coming in from Louis Armstrong Airport to come to the city. I think it was for like some corporate insurance company. I'm paraphrasing, but like talking about, you know, the voodoo magic, they'll ask how we do it, that sort of thing. Or when you go down Bourbon Street, I try to think of like, you know, like them selling like, this is Jewish alcohol, or this is an insurance company watching over for Jesus. How that would fly. I was curious in the 20th century if there was really, I don't know how strong voodoo traditions still are, but if there was any pushback on kind of the Zionism, fetishization of voodoo.
Okay. So let me answer you very quickly. There was no Jewish community. There were individual Jews. They had no institutions that we would say are crucial to defining something as a community. Now, they may have socialized with each other. We know nothing about what went on in their homes, if behind closed doors they observed any Jewish practices, and therefore we could think about, there was no community. And so they left where they had family. They went back to Curacao, they went to Suriname, they went to Newport, they went to Cuba. So they went to all the places around the Atlantic world where they had family and trading partners, and then one by one filter back, but it's not a community. Okay, but it's a very important point about this era.
We're out of time, apparently. I'll say quickly in response to your question, though, that we operate under this mistaken notion in the U.S. that you can't commodify religion. We do it all the time. And it's not just voodoo. We like to look at voodoo as if it's an outlier. Arguably, New Orleans has gotten really good at it, but it's not an outlier in that respect. And in terms of pushback, you have a lot of practitioners in the city who have gone through a lot of work, spent their entire lives to validate their practice by studying under godparents from places like Haiti and West Africa in order to demonstrate this line of ritual practice that is seen as legitimate. So they're not equated with the more commercialized, commodified notions of voodoo. But thank you guys so much.
Thank you. That was fun.